When corporations can no longer afford these particular services, do you think any of these corporations or any of these banks in the world who are concerned about poverty will extend to them the exact same assistance that they will provide the people in the third world? Absolutely not. This simply means that if this is an issue of being able to extend assistance to corporations as well, because they made it an issue now, then we think that it's ultimately still better and under our side. But here's the last thing. Examine the world where they want their model to occur. They want to force corporations who have ever sold anything to poor nations to forever be tied to the fate of that nation. If that is the case, and the Philippine government starts opening up bidding processes to give us supplies and services, do you think any reasonable corporation that does not want to be tied to that nation will take up that particular offer? None of them will, or they will jack up the prices even more than they have in status quo. Because the cost they want to look at is not just in the near 5 years or in the warranty period that they're going to try and offset, but forever. Because you have the ability to apparently predict that your product should last forever until the end of time, right? No amount of money, ladies and gentlemen, will be used and can match the type of deterrence that they're providing corporations under their side. And the only thing worse than the experience of having no one to repair your product because it's too expensive is not having the service and product available to your people from the start. That's why if you really want to take care of third world nations, if you really want corporations to progress, you cannot be under their model. Thanks.
Thank you for predicting the group team. Next, I have to call up on the government week here.
So this debate was finally converged into basically 2 or 3 things. The first thing will be about examining the necessity as to whether this policy is necessary or not by examining the situation happening now, especially in developing countries. And second thing is about the moral rationale behind this policy, whether this policy or actually the restriction of the corporation right is something justifiable or not. And third thing is about which paradigm is better, the forward life in the developing countries, and that's the last point that's said by the vote. So, and all rebuttals are basically included in my speech, so straightforward to the first argument. So, about the necessity. Yuki spent so much minutes by explaining that how different the commodity we are talking about is different from the ultimate products like OS or actually those kind of the stuff for the ordinary persons. Actually, it's crucially fatal to all the citizens' life because it's strongly connected to the idea of the nation, of the economy, just the consumption life, etc., etc. And two, how the countries are financially incapable to follow those kinds of technological improvement, which is something forced by the movement of the company or in the first place. So that's a crucial necessity provided by the Yuki, but it's a shallow response coming from the opposition side. So examining one by one, the first thing was that because it's a capitalism and that the company will keep producing this stuff, etc., etc., but it's fundamentally not true in the first place. The aim of the company is not keeping their own benefit, but they're increasing their own benefit in the first place. That's why the many companies set the limit to actually continue the support, and they forcefully stop it and stimulate the consumers to buy more and more. That because of that process and incentive of the company exists, those kind of the keep producing argument is nothing but ridiculous in the first place. Moreover, the issue of Youngcho said something, if there's a problem, then we can compensate that. Ladies and gentlemen, oh really? We are not talking about just a commodity which is not so fatal to the individual right, but we are talking about the commodity which is extremely fatal to the individual life, and it's too late to compensate once the fault happens. How can you compensate the life of the person because the generator stops and the medical system stops and which finally dies? And how can you compensate those important economic deal which is stopped by the spare fault of the generators? Ladies and gentlemen, the fundamental assumption of the Youngcho is it can be compensated. But we are not talking about the ordinary commodity. We are talking about systemic risk, which is created by the existence of the services which is closely connected to the national economy. That's a crucial necessity to propose this policy because to ensure the continuation of the national services. So those kind of the compensation argument never stands in this debate. And Valeri said that because the capitalism has its self-correction mechanism, it's extremely good old analysis they're coming from the DLO. Mr. Speaker, we have to recognize the capitalism is not so perfect. It's empirically proven by seeing the history. Lots of capitalist schemes has failed in the first place, and moreover, the capitalism fundamentally negate the voice of the poor, the voice of the people in the periphery. That's why the disparity between rich and poor is actually disparity between rich and poor are increasing more and more. Those kind of the invisible harm arguments is empirically proven, but those kind of the claim was false, which is empirically proven by history, and moreover, because of the characteristic of the capitalism, which is closely connected to the negation of the people in the periphery, those kind of the self-collection argument never supports the efficacy of the policy in the first place. So, having to clarify the necessity of this policy, because every single argument coming from the opposition never substantiated or never negates the fundamental necessity proposed by the proposition side, we think the necessity is there. Before moving on second issue, yes.
Yes or no? All third world governments cannot negotiate with companies like the dignified governments that they are.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's technically yes, but it's not so equal, precisely because the government, those kind of services are one-sidedly provided by the company, so they have more say even in the next negotiation processes, and that makes the situation more and more difficult for the government to sustain their own systems. That's the crucial necessity for the existence of the continuous support for the nations. So, moving on to the second issue about the moral rationales. So, the opposition waged the battle between the company and nation, and because the company bears the idea of the profitability, and we have to protect it. We recognize that profitability of the company is extremely important, but it's not absolute in the first place. And Youngcho herself considered that those kind of rights will be restricted only when those kind of the action of the company that actively harms the others. Yes, exactly. That's what we are talking about. Because those kind of coercive enforcement, which happens because of the one-sided decision by the company, and actually directly influences the budget allocation of the developing countries. Since those kind of developing countries have extremely limited budgets, and we have to they do face the systematic failure of the efficient budget allocation because the companies offer the stopping the continual support regardless of the situation in the domestic companies, regardless of the situation how actually they are affluent or how actually they are facing the financial difficulty. Those kind of situations, so those damages will finally trickle down the person on the ground, and it actually damages the well-being of the person on the ground. That's the harm we are talking about, and that's the rationale to propose this policy based on their argumentation, so it's just completely justifiable in the first place. And moreover, ladies and gentlemen, the information asymmetry issues, and Yuki clearly told you that because the company one-sidedly have the information and where the technology goes, and that will be one of the rationale to propose this policy. And Valeri said election or the loss of the self-correction mechanism that the developing countries having, but we are not talking about the situation inside the developing countries. We are talking about the relationship between country and companies. So as long as the company has the systemic cause of the problem, it's not efficient to tackle the problem by changing the structure of the inside country. So the argumentation coming from Valeri is not so efficient in the first place. Lastly, Valeri said how this policy will actually tarnish the future connection between the companies and developing countries. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not so fatal as long as there's a possibility of the profit, and they can still see the huge possibility of the gaining by getting the huge initial cost from the domestic developing countries. They will still do that, we propose.
I thank government. Now to co-open the petition with here.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, here we are in a debate about old products that are close to the end of their shelf life and sent to the scrap heap. For some reason, this debate speaks to me at a very personal level. The framing of the government in this debate is interesting because in the government's world, all products are bought by governments in third worlds, first of all. Secondly, the end users of these products are dirt poor farmers who can't fucking read. And then thirdly, that companies tend to sell these people shit because, the evil corporations, etc., etc. Now, that framing obviously makes it very attractive to say, yes, these corporations are selling lemons to the people in these countries. The people in these countries don't have any information. They're stupid. The government has ripped them off. Of course, the company should pay for the fruit of their misdeeds. But that framing is fundamentally dishonest because that captures only a tiny proportion of all of the contracts that go on between rich world and poor world. That framing doesn't capture the fact that in many countries, the people who are buying these products aren't necessarily governments. They may be consumers, they may be mid-sized businesses, they may be family businesses. There are all sorts of different situations in which products are bought from rich countries and taken to poor countries. So I want to look at a couple of things, or three things. First of all, where the products come from. Secondly, how they are used. And then thirdly, how they become obsolete. Let's start with the first one. Is the characterizations of the government, basically, that many of these are bought by governments from these companies, and therefore there's an asymmetry of information. I have a couple of things to say to this. Well, first of all, they admitted companies themselves don't have perfect knowledge. So it's not necessarily the case that a company sells something to a government knowing that in 10 years' time it'll be obsolete. That may happen, and we don't deny it. There will be times when it does happen, but we don't think that is characterization that generally necessarily applies. Secondly, no thank you. They said, we're talking about lazy third world governments here who aren't accountable to their people. We say, well, there are lots of problems with governance in the developing world. We say, first of all, many governments are responsible, and secondly, because governments don't have much money, they are trying to get value for money. Thirdly, we think governments actually do have a lot of bargaining power in this position, because governments are often putting things out to tender. Governments are trying to get the best deal for their people, or at least they're trying to get the best deal for their government. So we don't necessarily accept the characterization from that side of the debate that governments too are these kind of gullible consumers who are being sold something shiny and they're just willing to take the first person that comes along. So we just simply don't think it's necessarily true, as Val said, that governments, no thank you, don't have knowledge about these things. But furthermore, they never explain why this asymmetry of information, if it exists, is greater between developing country governments and corporations than it is, say, between developed country consumers and corporations. Because corporations know everything about when the next iPhone is coming out, and we don't until a week before it's actually announced. We didn't understand why the normal balance between consumer and corporation, which applies in richer countries, suddenly breaks down when the consumers in question, no thank you, are poorer. Not necessarily dirt poor, but poorer. You didn't explain that. But we also see that it's not simply governments that purchase these. It's also individuals, it's also businesses. The Deputy Prime Minister's framing these people are, they're unable to read the warranty, blah, 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 blah. We say, well, that's not necessarily the case. First of all, because consumers in these countries often are very savvy. They do have a very keen sense of value for money. They're not necessarily buying something because they're too stupid to know that it's going to fall apart in 2 days. But secondly, it's actually also often bought from the state. It's often that things which have been bought by governments in past years are then sold on to private consumers. In that case, we think it's the state's responsibility, not the original sellers 20 or 30 years ago. No, thank you, not just yet. Secondly, how the product's used in the lifespan of the product. Well, we heard from Val about the idea of a niche market and the free market. And again, we think when companies are actually providing products to people, there is a competition between companies. Governments don't simply have one seller for a particular kind of generator. They will have multiple sellers. If they are bulk buying, governments actually do have a bargaining power in this situation. So we think, in fact, in many cases, these corporations do continue to provide support, frankly, long after it might not make economic sense, partly because they want to retain the loyalty of these consumers. In developing countries where often brand names from abroad have a particular cachet, and they don't want to poison the well of future prosperous countries like South Korea by leaving those people in the shit. But furthermore, because it actually is profitable for a very long time. When there's 1 billion people in India and you're selling the same product to people and it's going to be used for 20 or 30 years, actually may be profitable to continue the upkeep. But as Val told you in her speech, if people aren't able to go to these companies to get these things repaired, if they're not able to get the part, then often what you see is whole cottage industries springing up in these countries to actually continue to repair these products long after the original corporation has ceased to do it. So we actually see plenty of third-party maintenance, plenty of third-party repair. So the harms that Yuki talked about in his average kind of speech, those harms, he didn't actually explain why the harms of discontinuation were quite as serious as he characterized them. He talked about syringes in hospitals, and we all gasped. But he didn't explain why these harms are so fatal to the well-being of people in the developing world, because it's simply not the case that if a company stops providing parts for your generator, that your generator will stop working and never run again. That's simply not the case. Yes, sir.
So you concede that if consumers are not able to consent, then this externality should not be pushed onto them. You're just offering different versions of the world
In your version of the world where governments buy things and then consumers are powerless, we think it's the government responsible for making bad decisions. We don't think it's the corporation's responsibility. Assuming that the product actually works, and assuming that 50 years down the line, the end user isn't getting good value for money because the product isn't working very well, we don't think that's the corporation's responsibility 50 years in the future. And that comes to the third part, how and why these corporations discontinue these products. Because under your model, these corporations will support these products forever. So we will go to find the de Havilland Corporation, or whoever they are nowadays, that made the DC-3 that this farmer is using to spray his crops. The DC-3 that was purchased by the Air Force in 1948. We will find them and we will force them to provide the parts for this product. We think this doesn't make any kind of sense. We think, first of all, as Youngcho told you in her speech, well, this is a breach of corporate rights, because companies shouldn't be reasonably expected to support a product 70 years in the future, and we didn't hear any idea of statute of limitations from the proposition, so we must assume that until this product literally falls apart, that could be part of their model. Secondly, we think corporations will be less likely to sell to these companies if they think they're going to be on the hook for these products in the year 2073, or more likely, they will raise their prices to cover the costs that are built in now to their purchase, to their sale to that country, or they'll simply give you the shitty product that the Prime Minister talked about. Either way, people are the ones who suffer. And finally, as they themselves said in the South Korean example, people will remember. People, once they are no longer living in a poor country, remember the companies that exploited them at that time, as you yourself said. And we think in that situation, as you said, companies are not stupid enough to deliberately exploit people who one day soon will be able to turn around and compete them out of business. So for all those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we're very proud to oppose.
I think opposition week, now to go for the opposition reply. Here.
Mr. Chair, there are two important things to remember in this debate. One, why side opposition wins, and two, why Yuki needs to get the 75. I'll prove this under 3 points. First, that government side just cannot win the round by trying to argue to us a convenient monocharacterization of the world. As an average reasonable person, we know that governments aren't singular. So A, if governments and third world governments really all have dictators, they cannot make, read terms and conditions, and at the same time they don't care about people like farmers, in these situations we gave you a couple of options that they may have. We told you, well, I guess they can run to the IMF and the World Bank, they'll be happy to give them loans. You can start safeguarding third world governments. You can try and ensure that there are lobbying efforts. In any case, there are multitudes of things that they did. The point is, we gave you responses to the worst case scenario that they were trying to push to us. But the question is, what if, and if only if, there are third world governments who actually can make responsible decisions, that sometimes can talk to corporations and sometimes care about their people as if they're dignified governments as well. And at times they do exist, even in my own country, right? Why then are they still forcing corporations, in this particular instance, to produce and to never abandon certain types of services? Because in these instances, the argument of information asymmetry and coercive bargaining does not exist, and it is untrue. But even in these instances, they were supposed to prove why governments and corporations should be forcing them to do that, right? They never proved it because their primary justification of asymmetric relationship is an incomplete explanation for a blanket policy that they should have been defending. But here's the thing, when they realized it was too difficult, they decided to shift that strategy. So from average, they became a bit below average. Why? Because by the time that Tom spoke, the shift, ladies and gentlemen, and the asymmetry is no longer between governments and corporations, as Yuki was arguing. It was between people Korean or a Chinese corporation who are also responsible to their own people, their own consumers, their own employees, to suddenly have a mandatory charity policy, ladies and gentlemen, for the third world, when they in any way did not choose to be responsible for that country, and for some reason it was the government who decided to buy their product after all, right? But here's the last thing. Even assuming that they didn't shift that way, they set goals that they never proved they will be able to achieve under their side. So even without us existing, their side just simply cannot stand. Why? Because this is a product of them ignoring Youngcho's second argument and my entire argument. They told us they wanted to take care of the developing world, right? Because the developing world, ladies and gentlemen, needs access to cheap options. And we think that's a good thing. But what they never proved is that in status quo, we don't already have niche markets so that when those corporations suddenly stop producing it, we can't get services from another country. Or that we can't just buy new products from a cheaper alternative, which definitely will be taken off by a different country or a different corporation that want to make profits. I talked to you about the niche market. They never even bothered responding to it. Or what about the very important argument of being able to refuse the exploitation, ladies and gentlemen, or the exploitation that they will create under their model? That if suddenly third world governments are going to be bound to the corporations that they will deal with, corporations will not want anything to do with you because their profits are their priority, not your country. Or second thing, they also set the goal of consumers. They wanted to talk about the individuals, the farmers, right? Youngcho told you that even if at their best case scenario, they will get the tractors cheap under our model and still get at the quality price, the other products that that corporation produces will suddenly jack up in prices because those are the products that will have to deliver on the sunk cost that this corporation will suddenly have. What about the farmer now and their television, their remote controls, their phones, ladies and gentlemen? These are simple luxuries and the only luxuries that some third world individuals will have, and you're going to cause the jack up in prices. And even then, they didn't have the response. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't truly care about the people you're trying to protect in a debate, it's very difficult to win. And these are the reasons why opposition side is going to take this round hands down. Thanks.
Thank you. To go on the opposition government here.
Here.
So after a very interesting introduction to the reply speaker, she actually failed to tell me why I should get a 75. She failed to tell me that's it. I do get a 75. I may get an average in this round, but this round was above average class. Therefore, I get an above average score. I explained it, she didn't. Getting into the debate per se. Alright, we need a rehash of the products that we're talking about. What is this debate about in the first place? Because it just went all over the place with all speakers shouting, ranting, and we need to calm down, right? So the products that we're talking about are products that are deeply rooted into a nation, into a nation's economy. Products that are uniquely important for a nation to survive, products that are deeply important, a core element of that nation. We're talking about things that these nations cannot simply opt out from or simply switch to other products. We're talking about products which these nations made a huge investment in the first place, therefore have a will not to change in the first place. Things I told you in my first speech. More specifically, we're talking about things like generators, which are now deeply rooted into the core of that state, wherein that nation in itself has modified its whole infrastructure, the whole system of society to suit that generator. We're talking about medical things, which in the same instance, the whole state has modified the infrastructure to suit to these products. In that instance, the first question is, when corporations make the decisions to stop supporting and to move on to new products, are there any harms done to these nations? A simple yes, no question, and we believe, regardless of how much of an extent of a harm it is, there is definitely a harm that exists. And this is a negative externality that we told you right from the very beginning of this debate. We told you that in order for these products to work for its full lifespan, they tried to shift it to saying forever, but we never said that. We said for the full lifespan of these products, we told you that these products require repairment at some stage in the future. But at that point in time, when these nations are going about purchasing these products, they are told that this generator will last for 60 years. This generator will last for 70 years. Therefore, that nation is in a position where he is under the under the assumption, a reasonable assumption, to think that that product will be in use for that amount of time, and that if any problems occur, then they could get support for that option. We think that this creates a situation where there is an implicit contract between the corporation and the buyer, where the corporation is providing to the buyer a set of products saying this can last for a certain amount of time. However, the corporation declining the support is going completely against that contract. Under their best case scenario, what they told us are the following. There are other corporations which can help support the products and can help maintain. There's the IMF, there's the World Bank, so on and so forth. The problem from our side of the house isn't necessarily first and foremost that there is a lack of other options, but most importantly, what we told you right through our bench is that it's forcing these buyers to act. It's placing the burden upon these buyers to act actively to get the maintenance, even though when you consider the contract and when you consider how the purchase was made, that buyer should be in a position where they can get the support regardless of whether they have to actively sort it out. We think that that's a position you're putting these buyers into, and we think that's the position which we think is inherently immoral for these corporations to put these people into. But moreover, we also need to understand the asymmetry of information that we spent so long talking about. The corporation may not have full knowledge, we accept that, but in a comparison between the amount of knowledge that these corporations who are experts in this field have, in a comparison with government officials who may not be experts in these instances, then we think that the corporation has a much better outlook of the future and can better foresee what products could be made or what developments could be made. Under that context, when the corporation goes about lobbying and marketing these products and making the buyers, the nations buy it, and then pulling out suddenly, we think that's something immoral and unjust, and that's something we want to prevent.
All speeches are over. I thank all speakers, shake your hands, and enjoy your party.